Tonight, Richard Nixon, Golda Meir, Henry Kissinger, and a whole cast of colorful characters. Let me begin just a little bit of very brief background on Richard Milhouse Nixon. He was born to a family of devout Quakers. His mother still, spoke in the traditional second person familiar, like thee and thou, uh, and he grew up in Yorba Linda, California. He was born in 1913. His was a tough childhood. It was a poor family. He was an outstanding student. He idolized his older brother, who died of tuberculosis. Ironically, it was in part because of his brother's death that he was able to have enough funds to go ahead and complete his education. But he was graduated second in his class from Whittier College. He majored in history. He was captain of the debate team. And because his academic performance was so strong, he received a full scholarship to Duke University Law. So he went to Duke Law School, graduated third in his class, and then returned to California. This was in the late 30s, and was admitted to the bar in California. Well, a couple of years later, along comes Second World War, and he joins the Navy. Excuse me. Nixon was in for 4 years. He had a college education, so he went in as an officer. He was a lieutenant, junior grade, and rose to lieutenant commander when he was discharged. So what do? You're a Navy veteran, a naval officer veteran. You had a law degree. Of course, you're going to go into politics, I guess. But that's what he does, and he is elected to Congress in 46, and again in 48. He runs unopposed, actually. And in 1950, he runs for the U.S. Senate from California. He wins. He defeats a woman named Helen Douglas by really falsely linking her to a communist background. He distributes 500,000 of these sheets that talk about her pink ties. Now, keep in mind also that in the 1950s, you had lots of people who were fellow travelers. They weren't hardcore communist ideologues, but there were lots and lots of folks who were sympathizers, fellow travelers. That's how so many folks were blackmailed, or blacklisted from Hollywood and government jobs, defense industries. It's what helped fuel the McCarthy era. It's what helped fuel Nixon's own role in HUAC, House Un-American Activities Committee, the HUAC. And HUAC, Nixon's big spotlight in the sun was his handling of the Alger Hiss case. Hiss was accused of being a Soviet spy. I'm not going to go into all of that now, but that helped make Nixon's reputation as a hardline anti-communist campaigner. So he beats Douglas for the Senate. He also, because of this campaign of innuendo, linking her to Red supporters and communism, he earns the unflattering sobriquet of Tricky Dick. So that's where Nixon gets his nickname, not from Watergate. He's Tricky Dick as early as 1950. But he's picked as Eisenhower's running mate. So he's been in the House for 4 years. He's then elected as senator, and he's only been a senator for 2 years. So his rise is kind of rather, rather like a meteor. So he gets picked as Eisenhower's VP in 52. He has solid anti-communist credentials. He is from the West, so he fits a lot of items on the vice presidential ticket bucket list, and he's picked, but he almost loses his place on Eisenhower's ticket. A few weeks before the Republican National Convention, some financial improprieties come to light. Some of his supporters had raised money to pay for campaign expenses that may or may not have gone to the campaign. But he goes and he appears on television for a half hour, and he gives a speech about his honesty, how anything that was done was inadvertent, and that he would certainly restore or return any money that was misused. But there was one gift that he received that he would not return: a little black and white dog named Checkers that his children loved oh so well, and he could not see tearing little Checkers from the bosom of his family. Well, it goes swimmingly well. Who cares about financial improprieties? Nixon is a loving dog owner, dog father, loves his children, and he goes on. He stays on the ticket, and he serves as Ike's VP for 2 terms, 52 and then again in 56. He loses narrowly to Kennedy in 1960, very narrowly, actually, but nevertheless. And then he runs for governor of California in 62. But again, he loses, this time to Edmund Pat Brown, after which he famously lashes out at reporters. Right? For 16 years, ever since the Hiss case, he says, you've had a lot of fun. Just think how much you're going to be missing. You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore, because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference. Hardly. Nixon had an interesting habit of, when he was talking to reporters in any kind of formal setting, he would often sometimes refer to himself in the third person. Despite his successes, he always felt like an outsider. Perhaps because he grew up in poverty in California, because he went to a small, not particularly well-known top-tier school, right? Not like Kennedy, who went to Harvard. Not that every president did. I mean, Kennedy, of course, FDR had those credentials. Truman certainly didn't. But in any event, Nixon also had a tendency to paranoia. He subscribed to conspiracy theories, some of them bordering on paranoia. And he would single out intellectuals, Ivy Leaguers, and Jews as the targets of his conspiracy theories. Arthur Schlesinger, the historian, theorizes that this goes back to FDR's New Deal and the brain trust that Roosevelt brought to Washington. Many of them were intellectuals. They were Ivy Leaguers, and a significant number were Jews. In fact, Nixon himself was quoted as saying, not publicly, but in talking about FDR's brain trust, that there were too many Ivy League men, too many intellectuals, too many radicals, too many Jews. We have lots of remarks. There are a whole bunch of his tapes were just recently released. There still are some left. There was something like 3,000 hours that was released. But we have all kinds of, even going back 20 years ago, when maybe only 400 or 500 hours were released. There was plenty of anti-Semitism on Nixon's tapes. Here are a couple of quotes. These were all from private remarks or culled from the tapes. The Jews are born spies, he says, with an arrogance that that makes a spy, right? He puts himself above the law. He said, if speaking about people who went to top tier schools, if they're from any Eastern schools or Berkeley, those are potentially the bad, particularly the potential bad ones. Nixon prized loyalty above almost everything else. So that may have also factored into it, because Jews didn't vote for Nixon. I mean, there were some who did, but in '68, when he won his first term, 80% of the Jewish vote went to Humphrey. He got about 17%, and 2% went to George Wallace. It's hard for me to imagine that 2%, but yeah, 2% went to George Wallace. Maybe they all lived in Alabama and knew him. In '72, when Nixon trounces McGovern, he does better. He gets up to 35%, but McGovern still receives 65% of the Jewish vote. So Nixon obviously isn't the first president to express anti-Semitic views in private, right? We remember our friend Harry S. Truman. I'll share with you maybe one of the more famous ones. This was Nixon talking to H.R. Haldeman. Haldeman was his chief of staff. This is in 1971. And he directs Haldeman to, quote, look at any sensitive areas of government where Jews are involved. Generally, you can't trust the bastards. They turn on you. Put someone in charge who is not Jewish. In fact, at one point during the stagflation of the early '70s, when unemployment was going up, but so was inflation, Nixon was convinced that Julius Shiskin, he was the head of the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. He was convinced that Shiskin was inflating unemployment statistics so that he would look bad. But, so clearly there have been presidents, or at least a president that we can look to in history, who, has personal theories about how data is used. I'll just stop there. But Shiskin is fired because Nixon refused to believe that he wasn't inflating unemployment statistics to make him look bad. Nixon really was a kind of Jekyll and Hyde, though. The anti-Semitism is there. You can't deny it. But then again, he also had quite a few Jews with whom he had a close relationship. William Safire, one of his most talented speechwriters. Arthur Burns who was chairman of the Federal Reserve, Herbert Stein, whom he appointed as head of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. And we'll get to Kissinger in a little bit. We'll leave Kissinger aside. And Leonard Garment, who was really in many ways one of Nixon's most important political advisors. Let's see if we can just share a picture of Leonard. Share the screen. Here we go. There's Leonard Garment. This is in his, should have been right around the time that he started working for Nixon in the late 60s. Garment, by the way, if you want to read he's a fascinating guy. So he attended Brooklyn Law. Why? He had the grades. He applied to Columbia, but when he went to law school, there were quotas still in place, and could not go to Columbia Law because the quota was filled. The Jewish quota was filled. So he ended up going to Brooklyn Law. And he did end up working as a litigator at a very prestigious firm, Mudge, Rose, Guthrie, and Alexander. Where in the early 1960s, a fellow named Richard Nixon came to work after he lost the election in California. Garment was a jazz musician, and not just, he was a professional musician. He played in big bands. He was kind of a lawyer by day and a jazz musician by night. I think Garment and Nixon kind of found each other because they both were outsiders in a certain way. And even though Garment was a staunch Democrat, later he became an independent, but they somehow formed an unlikely friendship. Nixon played piano. Garment played jazz sax. And often Garment would host the Nixons in his Brooklyn Heights home. So Garment joins Nixon's campaign staff. Nixon invites him, and even though he's not a Republican, but he served on Nixon's campaign staff in '68, helped advise Nixon on the selection of cabinet members. And in the first term, Nixon's first term, he's his advisor on minority issues. As the Watergate scandal grew during Nixon's second term, Garment is the one who advises Nixon to fire Haldeman and Ehrlichman. Kind of funny. Haldeman had, was also quite the anti-Semite. So here's the Jew advising Nixon with his anti-Semitic streak to fire another anti-Semite. But in any event, Garment, who was advising Nixon, said, "You got it. It's getting too close." He didn't say a cancer is growing on the presidency. That was John Dean, but he did say you got to get rid of Haldeman and Ehrlichman, and both of them resigned. That same day, John Dean, White House attorney, is fired, and Nixon asks Garment to replace John Dean, which he does. But then when he wants access to Nixon's tapes, he's denied the access. And then Garment resigns. He felt he couldn't serve as Nixon's lawyer without having access to the tapes. It was rumored by some that Leonard Garment was Deep Throat, right? You saw All the President's Men. Deep Throat is that shadowy figure. I think it's Hal Holbrook, maybe, who stands in the shadows, telling Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein about what the monkey business going on in the Nixon administration. I don't think it was Garment. Garment didn't have the insider knowledge, and honestly, he was trying to defend Nixon. So it seems far-fetched that he would have been Deep Throat. So we'll get to Henry in just a little bit. But let's take a look at one of my favorite photos of Richard Nixon. It's a precious photo. Here we go. You may have seen this one, right? Golda is right. Nixon is really, whatever it was very funny, but he's laughing. Golda Meir is smiling. It's a beautiful, beautiful photo. So we're going to talk a little bit about Nixon and Israelis. Maybe I'll leave that up for a few moments. Nixon liked Israelis a lot. He was close to Golda Meir, Moshe Dayan, Yitzhak Rabin. Rabin actually would break diplomatic protocol and campaign for Nixon in 1972. Right? This is when he is, let me find the photo. Here we go. Okay, let's just do this. Find the photo and share it again. Now this photo is from earlier, right? You can see that Rabin is wearing his Army uniform. Nixon also looks a little bit younger. This picture was taken in Israel, maybe 2-3 weeks after the 6-Day War. You say, well, what is Nixon doing sitting in front of Yitzhak Rabin's desk? Well, he's not president. He's not even yet officially a candidate. But there he is in Israel, late June of '67, visiting with Rabin. So their relationship went back, considerably before his becoming president, and considerably before Rabin becomes ambassador. Nixon saw his, kind of resolute, paranoid, Cold Warrior style reflected in Israelis, right? They were hard-edged realists, which is what he saw himself as being. In his memoirs, he wrote that Golda Meir conveyed simultaneously the qualities of extreme toughness and warmth. She used her emotions, and they did not use her. President Nixon has done many things that nobody would have thought of doing, Meir said, toasting Nixon during the latter's visit to Israel, the state visit that he made. We'll show a clip of that in just a moment. All I can say, Mr. President, as friends and as an Israeli citizen to a great American president, thank you. As I said, Nixon had that special relationship with Rabin, who became Israel's ambassador to the U.S. The end of Nixon's first term and into his second. So for those who were thinking that Bibi Netanyahu was the first to commit the unpardonable sin of butting into U.S. political matters, No, that would be Yitzhak Rabin, who preceded Bibi by 45 years, right? So during his time in Washington, as an Israeli ambassador, he berates American Jewish leaders for criticizing Nixon's handling of Vietnam. Right? So interestingly, American Jews criticizing their own president over an affair that is not related to Israel. Only Jews could do this. Right? But he publicly reprimands American Jewish leaders for criticizing Nixon. And then in the 72 campaign, again, he's still ambassador. He openly speaks out in favor of Nixon's reelection. Right? That's his Pasnicht. You're not supposed to do that, but he did it. Jews still voted for McGovern. 2-to-1 margin. So, what can we learn from that? I don't know. But obviously, Rabin's endorsement didn't overcome the qualms that American Jews had, and Israel is certainly an important part of an American Jewish agenda, but maybe not the only thing. However, here's one thing good that may have come out of Rabin's faux pas, and that is, again, as I said earlier, Nixon appreciated loyalty. So Rabin's full-throated support might have been a factor in Nixon's decision to be as supportive of Israel during the Yom Kippur War as it turned out. Who's to say? I mean, we don't know, but it obviously didn't hurt. There are all kinds of ways that before the Yom Kippur War that Nixon had been supportive of Israel. He had favored granting low interest loans, totaling about $400 million a year. It was not, chump change in the late 60s. In December 69, his own Secretary of State, William Rogers, comes up with something called the Rogers Plan. Israel would withdraw from the Sinai in exchange for Egypt granting permanent peace. The Israelis didn't like it, not because they objected to the withdrawal from Sinai. They wanted recognition of their sovereignty. And Nasser was not going to grant that. Nixon, on the strength of Israel's objections, quashed the plan. I mean, the Egyptians didn't agree to it, so neither were interested. But it was interesting that Nixon took the side of Israel over his own Secretary of State. And during the tragedy of the Olympic Games in '72, Nixon, not only spoke out, gave a personal statement upon hearing the news, but also sent a formal announcement, a formal message the day after. Now, compare and contrast that with the United Nations. The UN did nothing. The US sponsored a motion condemning the act of terrorism at the Munich Olympics. And the motion went nowhere. It was not entertained. It was defeated by the General Assembly. Now, 2 months before his resignation, right, Watergate is well underway. He becomes the first president to visit Israel as a matter of state. This is a state visit. And speaking at Ben Gurion Airport, he sounds relieved, almost like he had come home. I'm going to show you a clip of that. The very beginning, only going to look at a couple of minutes of it, of Nixon actually speaking. He's introduced by Ephraim Katzir. Katzir was the president of Israel at the time, and this is it was Lod Airport. I don't think it was yet Ben Gurion. I may be wrong, but also the same place where 2 years earlier there had been the Red Brigade, the Japanese terrorist attack that had taken place at Lod. But anyway, be that as it may, let's take a look at this. Let's see, I'm go back here, and okay, this is from the Nixon Library. This particular tape. Let me share. Okay, we got that, I think. All right, it's up. And here we go.
And in the spirit of the profound friendship between our nations, I bid you Baruch haba.
Well, Mr. President, Mr. Prime Minister, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is for me, as I'm sure all of you can imagine, a very great moment to be standing here, as the President has indicated, as the first president to be here in Israel. And particularly so because our two countries have been joined together in friendship from the time of Israel's birth as a nation in our modern times. We have been through over these years some difficult times. During the period that I have served as President of the United States, we have been through some difficult times together. And I can only say that the friendship that we have for this nation, the respect and the admiration we have for the people of this nation, their courage, their tenacity, their firmness in the face of very great odds, is one that makes us proud to stand with Israel as we have in the past in times of trouble, and now to work with Israel in a better time, a time that we trust will be a time of peace.
Okay. So, Richard Nixon in June of '74, on the start of the first state visit of any sitting U.S. president to Israel. So now we're at the junction where we have to talk about this fellow here, right, who plays such an important role in Richard Nixon's presidency. By the way, if you're interested in reading more about Kissenger, Walter Isaacson's biography, he's a master biographer, has written on a bunch of different people. I enjoyed reading his book on Einstein as well, but Walter Isaacson's biography of Kissenger, who's still very much with us. He'll be 98 come spring, in May, I think his birthday is. But you might want to read his book on Henry Kissinger. So I want to talk a little bit about Kissinger's background, and then we'll get to the Yom Kippur War and what role Kissinger played or didn't play. But here's a little bit of his own personal history. Henry, or Heinz, was born Heinz, but many German Jews when they came to this country, chose to change to more anglicized names. My own father, may he rest in peace, was Hans, but he took his Hebrew name, Emmanuel, and became Emmanuel. But Kissenger was Heinz Alfred back in Bavaria. He was born in 23. In 38, when he was a teenager, he was 15, his family fled Germany as a result of Nazi persecution. They stayed in England for a brief period and then came to the States. Kissenger recalls, being harassed regularly by the Jugend, by the Hitler Youth, and he was barred from attending the gymnasium in Bavaria, in Fürth, which is where he was from. His father, who was a teacher, was dismissed from his job. These were, the things that happened to the German Jews in the 30s. When they came to the States, they moved to Washington Heights. That's where so many German Jewish immigrants ended up, on the far upper west side, north of where the George Washington Bridge was built in the late 30s. And Kissenger assimilated into American culture very quickly, though he never lost his heavy German accent. In part because he was shy and didn't have a lot of friends. So I guess he was kind of a homebody who stayed around the house where his parents spoke German. He obviously became very proficient in English, but never lost that accent. After his first year at George Washington High School, he began going to high school at night. He worked in a shaving brush factory during the day. And people don't realize that's what he had to do. He went to college. He started at CCNY, City College of New York, and he was studying accounting. He excelled academically, but of course his studies were interrupted in 43 when he's drafted into the U.S. Army. In June of 43, just about 5 years after he came to the States, he became a citizen. And this is while he's in the military that he becomes a citizen. It's noticed that he is not only, very intelligent, but he's obviously a native German speaker. So he's assigned to the military intelligence section of the 84th Division, and he sees combat with the division. He also volunteers for hazardous intelligence duties during the Battle of the Bulge. He was fairly close to the front lines, interrogating German prisoners of war, trying to determine the movement of the Wehrmacht and Hitler's tank divisions. Now, when the Americans advance into Germany, Kissenger is only a private, but he's put in charge of the administration of the city of Krefeld because there weren't enough German speakers on the division's intelligence staff. Within a week, he has established a civilian administration all on his own. Now, keep in mind, he's 22 at this time? He also is then reassigned to the CIC, the Counterintelligence Corps. He becomes a CIC special agent. He's promoted to sergeant, and he's given the job of tracking down Gestapo officers, for which he's awarded the Bronze Star. After his discharge in 46, Kissenger returns to school, but he applies to transfer to Harvard, right? And he's accepted. He receives his bachelor's degree summa cum laude, And then he also receives his master's and his PhD from Harvard in 51 and 54, respectively. Now, he goes on to become a member of the faculty, teaching in Department of Government. This is before the JF School of Government Affairs is founded. He becomes a consultant to the NSC's coordinating board, National Security Council. He is on the Council of on Foreign Relations. He also serves on as a consultant to a number of think tanks, including the RAND Corporation. All right, so let's keep this in mind. He is a Jew, he's an Ivy Leaguer, and he's an intellectual. So by rights, he should have 3 strikes before Nixon. I mean, this would be exactly the kind of guy that you would expect Nixon to run away from. He starts off in politics by becoming a foreign policy advisor to Nelson Rockefeller. And he advises Rockefeller, who tries unsuccessfully for the nomination 3 different times. 60, when he loses to Nixon, 64, where he loses to Goldwater, and 68, where he loses again to Nixon. So Kissinger first meets Richard Nixon in 67, and he reports that he found him, quote unquote, more thoughtful than he expected. During the 68 Republican primary, though, Kissinger calls Nixon, this is a direct quote, the most dangerous of all the men running to have as president. But when Nixon won the Republican nomination, apparently Henry had a change of heart. And soon he contacted a Nixon aide, and he is on the Nixon campaign as an advisor. And then in January of 69, he's appointed as National Security Advisor at the White House. Now, keep in mind, Nixon is not the Secretary of State. He only becomes that in the second term, and even that not until August of 73. But he does an incredible amount in terms of foreign policy. He's the first American government official to go to China since 1949, and paves the way for Nixon's historic 1972 visit to the People's Republic of China. He also plays a principal role in negotiating the SALT I agreement, the Strategic Arm Limitation talks with the Soviet Union in May of 72. And he plays a pivotal role in orchestrating the Paris Peace Accords with North Vietnam in January of 73. None of this is Secretary of State. I wonder what William Rogers was doing. But it's that which gets him the Nobel Peace Prize. He's the co-recipient with Lee Duc-Tho of North Vietnam, although Lee Duc-Tho accuses the U.S. afterwards of violations of their agreement and refuses to accept the prize. But anyway, Kissinger certainly doesn't refuse to accept his half of the prize. But all of that, the visit to Red China, bringing the war in North Vietnam to an end, helping pave the way for the first strategic arms curb on nuclear weaponry with the Soviet Union. All of that, Henry Kissinger played a huge role in. In August of 73, he becomes Secretary of State, 9 months into Nixon's second term. He's also the first Jew to serve as Secretary of State. And most scholars of foreign affairs will tell you that Kissinger, right, who remained the NSA advisor, the National Security Affairs advisor to the White House, while he was Secretary of State, the only Secretary of State to do so, that he was, if not the most influential Secretary of State of the 20th century, he's up there with maybe one other, Dean Acheson. But that's that's quite a quite a role. And again, a Jew, intellectual, and an Ivy League professor. During Nixon's first term in office, Kissinger really didn't have much to do with Middle Eastern affairs. But within 2 months of his appointment, Secretary of State, he would have a lot to do, because on October 6, 1973, Israel found itself in the midst of the Yom Kippur War. Now, Nixon really stands out among presidents for taking the boldest risk for Israel. A critical airlift, arms airlift, during the 73 Yom Kippur War. I was reading that there were an astonishing 567 missions by American aircraft, right? And that doesn't include deliveries that came by sea or El Al flights. El Al actually carried, El Al planes also carried needed resupply, whatever it was, hardware or ammunition for Israel. It really kept Israel in the war at a critical junction. And for those, I think most of us remember. I was young. Everybody has one of those moments like 9/11, or for those who are perhaps a little more mature, who remember Kennedy's assassination. It's one of those moments you know where you were, like landing on the moon. I have vivid memories, even as a 10-year-old, at the start of the Yom Kippur War. In addition to the military hardware, Nixon also asks Congress for $2.2 billion. This is 1973, so $2.2 billion. It's not a small amount of change today. It was a huge chunk of change almost 50 years ago, to cover the cost of military aid. So it wasn't just supplying Israel, it was essentially giving Israel what it needed. The first couple of weeks were touch and go, but by October 19th, in significant part because of this massive rearmament and resupply, Israel goes on to really turn the tide, achieve victory, and then 6 days after that, a ceasefire goes into effect, so that the war is essentially just shy of 3 weeks. So Nixon perhaps had little to gain and much to lose. Right? He was in his second term, and by then the law had changed, so he wasn't going to be running for a third term. And in any case, he had never done well with the Jewish vote, so it wasn't like it could be said he was, pandering. And as we know, looking in retrospect, that airlift helped spur an Arab oil embargo, right? Driving gasoline prices sky high. Have memories of what it was like in the mid 1970s. And he was also at that point preoccupied. Watergate was beginning to burgeon into something very, very serious, a threat to his presidency. And against the advice of any number of his advisors, Nixon risked a confrontation with the Soviets, right? Because they were the ones who were backing and supplying Egypt and Syria. So Nixon deserves a lot of credit for that. And now, Henry. Henry, there is a lot of controversy about Henry Kissinger's role in the Yom Kippur War. Number one, Kissinger did advise Israel not to mount a preemptive strike. But the fact is, Israel couldn't have mounted a preemptive strike if it had wanted to. I mean, Israel really was caught, so to speak, with, its pants down. And they had some intelligence, but it wasn't treated as seriously as it should have been. And they knew the attack was coming, but of course, trying to mount mobilization during Yom Kippur. So Kissinger's warning or advice really was meaningless because they just didn't have that. This was not 67. 67, Israel knew exactly what it was going to do and took the initiative. The shoe was on the other foot this time around. Golda Meir always felt that Kissinger could have done more to support Israel. She suspected that Kissinger wanted to engineer things so that Sadat could have enough credit to claim that he had taught Israel a lesson, which would then allow him to make an overture for peace on his own terms. Right? Which Sadat did in 77, and he had enough, credit with he had gotten much farther with Israel than any other, Arab leader or general had ever done. So that was Golda's sense of things. But there are a lot of historians who don't agree with that. There are some who think that James Schlesinger, ironically a Jew or a former Jew, Schlesinger was the defense secretary at the time. And incidentally, a convert to Christianity, right? So I guess halachically he was still Jewish, but he didn't see himself as such. Schlesinger opposed Kissinger's efforts to send Israel the aircraft she needed. And Walter Isaacson, Kissinger's biographer, and maybe he's biased, we'll never know, but he maintains that Schlesinger and Schlesinger's deputy secretary, a guy named William Clements, a Texas oil man with strong pro-Arab sympathies, that he engineered a 4-day delay in starting the weapons resupply airlift to Israel. Tellingly, Nixon's chief of staff during the Yom Kippur War, right, General Alexander Haig, agrees that it was Schlesinger, not Kissinger, Schlesinger, who dragged his feet as defense secretary, which he certainly had the ability to do. But that's what resulted in the start of in delaying the start of the airlift. Kissinger himself would remark to American Jewish leaders, "How can I, as a Jew who lost 13 relatives in the Holocaust, do anything that would betray Israel?" Be that as it may, Golda Meir always considered Nixon, not Kissinger, Israel's savior. She wrote her sister Clara, right, who lived in the States. We all know Golda Meir grew up in the United States. Family came here after they escaped Russia. And she wrote to Clara, who stayed in the States, "You're an American. You don't like Nixon. I'm an Israeli. I'll never forget that if it hadn't been for Nixon, we would have been destroyed." And Nixon himself believed this. He would later remark, "Christ, if it weren't for me, there wouldn't be any Israel." Golda knows that, even though they being American Jews, may not know it over here. Well, one fellow, let's see if we can find, here we are, who certainly knew it. This is sort of an odd postscript to Richard Nixon. Let me just share this picture. There we go. It's okay if you don't recognize. I mean, there's Pat, and there's Richard Nixon. The fellow who is kind of holding his hips is a rabbi named Baruch Korf. This is a strange postscript to Watergate and Nixon's resignation. As Watergate was reaching its climax, most Jews and most of the Jewish leadership, distanced itself from Nixon. Right, and we forget sometimes that at the end, this was bipartisan. And Nixon's, there were Republicans who told Nixon, look, we don't want to see our party goes through this. We don't want to see the American people go through this. It was knowing that there was no way out that caused him to resign. But that fellow you saw in the picture, Rabbi Baruch Korf, was a strong defender of Nixon. In fact, in 1973, he forms the National Citizens Committee for Fairness to the Presidency. He's a pulpit rabbi at the time, but the organization's purpose is to preserve the office of the presidency. It's kind of odd. Nobody was advocating the abolition of the office, just the removal of the occupant. Korf himself was ordained at Yeshiva University. Quite a right-wing activist. He was a supporter of the Stern Gang, and actually had at one point was involved in a plot to bomb London. I mean, get an airplane and bomb London after World War II, and in the face of English intransigence, the British intransigence over things going on in Palestine. He's arrested by the French and he goes on a hunger strike, and then he falls into a coma after 17 days and they release him. I mean, this guy is a character. Korf takes out advertisements in support of Nixon in 25 different major urban newspapers, and he raises $1 million for his defense. In May of '74, he gets a personal appointment with Nixon, and that was that picture that I showed you, and he writes a book entitled The Personal Nixon, Staying on the Summit. And then later he authors The President and I. Richard Nixon's rabbi reveals his role in the saga that traumatized the nation. In all fairness, I have to say, Nixon did at one point refer to him as my rabbi. Korf would write, quote, I regard him, Richard Nixon, as a man who has been vilified, savaged, brutalized, holding out against willful people who are unworthy of polishing his shoes. Not surprised that Nixon liked him. When Nixon resigned in August of '74, Rabbi Korf was there. He was there as he addressed members of the White House staff. He was the only person there who was not a member of the White House staff. And some 20 years later, shortly before his death in '95, '96, but he would claim that Deep Throat, right, was actually TV journalist Diane Sawyer.
Wow.
who in 1974 actually was an assistant in the Nixon press office. Sawyer denied the allegation, and again, who knows? But I'm not sure that somebody that was at the second or third tier in Nixon's press office would have access and knowledge of what would be on the tapes. And I tend to, I'm biased, but I would tend to, because I'm not big on conspiracy theories. I would probably go with Diane Sawyer and not with Rabbi Korf, with all due respect to Rabbi Korf.
Okay.
That's my personal bias.
So, Rabbi, we know who he is. It was Mark Felt, who was Associate Director of the FBI.
So
That's been come out.
So yes, but if you like Diane Sawyer better, then you can have Diane Sawyer. On Rabbi Korf say so. So in any event, I'm going to stop here. But I invite questions, comments. I guess the only thing I would say, just to sum things up, is that Nixon was, in many ways, a deeply flawed president, a deeply flawed individual, but he was also a tragic figure. His insecurity had an ironic side in that he didn't need to go send plumbers or have his henchmen send plumbers into the DNC's Watergate office. He blew McGovern away. We can say that now with hindsight, but he won, an overwhelming and convincing mandate. And look, he did many good things. The EPA, right? That was a creation of the Nixon White House. A lot of desegregation lawsuits and integration efforts in schools happened during the Nixon administration. Obviously opening up a door to China, the first arms agreement curbing nuclear proliferation with the Soviet Union, the end of the Vietnam War, and that's not in any way beatifying him or canonizing him, but he had some, real achievements. In his later years, he kind of reinvented himself as sort of the elder statesman, but he often had, very incisive takes on politics and international affairs. And whatever his deep flaws, we shouldn't lose sight of that. And without for a moment forgetting Watergate or anything else. And one does not cancel out the other. But we also have someone who was an absolute steadfast friend to Israel in arguably the hour of her greatest need since the time of her establishment, because in those first days and that first week of the Yom Kippur War, we didn't know where things were going. I'll stop there, and I invite questions, comments, thoughts.
Rabbi.
Yes.
One of the most famous photographs took place in Nixon's office when Henry Kissinger was
Right.
told to go down on his hands and knees and to pray.
Yes, the night before Nixon's
Right.
resignation. The funny thing is, that was perhaps the first time Kissinger had prayed in.
Yeah, well, Henry Kissinger was not a devout Jew.
No,
No.
he was, but he
forthcoming.
never denied that who he was or where he came from. He would talk about his experience as a Jew growing up in Nazi Germany, but this was not a guy who went to shul.
No.
He was not even a 3-day-a-year Jew. No.
No.
And he has a lot to thank Rockefeller, because Rockefeller really pulled him and moved him up into the government.
Yes. Yes, it was. That was his first exposure as his as Rockefeller's foreign policy advisor.
In Nixon's autobiography, In the Arena, chapter after chapter are stories of his defeat and him picking himself up again to fight the next round.
Yes.
Okay, I'll buy that.
Go ahead, Stephen, Dr. Cantor.
Yeah, just a few comments. You mentioned many of Nixon's flaws, and there was a very great rabbi in the Boston area, Rabbi Soloveitchik, who was a guy within the Orthodox movement. And he made the comment that if one does one good thing in his life, then that eradicates all the bad things.
Looks different than Cantor.
That one good thing was
Stephen Cantor.
Oh,
Not
I thought it was.
Now, I also understand that because Israel was in very dire straits during the Yom Kippur War, Israel had actually armed their nuclear weapons because they had their missiles. And Kissinger told them to disarm them, and Israel refused to. And that may have been one of the factors that caused the resupply to happen, because Israel was going to go nuclear had they not gotten that resupply. And
Yes,
also,
13 bombs.
yeah, and also I had worked for Golda Corporation, very similar to the Rand Corporation.
He talks a lot. Every single
Right.
mission he talks.
If we could just maybe be on mute, because we can all hear everybody else's conversation.
Yeah, and I spoke to an Air Force colonel who was in charge of the resupply to Israel. And normally the United States would have resupplied them going to Tel Aviv, but they didn't. They went right into the war area, right into the Sinai and into the Negev, which was unusual. And they had to stop radio communication when the Air Force went in. And they never knew where they're going to come back until they left that area. So it was a tremendous asset to Israel at the time.
Yeah, no question. No question. Other comments, thoughts? Go ahead, Georgia.
Yes. The anti-Semitism, prevailing anti-Semitism in the country, but I guess I now, after listening to so many of your lectures, can see where an anti-Semite can support Israel, that they do not like Jews, but they like Israel, they like the homeland. And I thought there was, a lot of Christians that want Israel to succeed, but that they would never support a Jewish person. Is this correct?
And it's hard to, even Truman, he had a close Jewish friend and business partner. People can, it almost sounds like that old anti-Semitic, some of my best friends, ... but there's some truth to it. In general, when you know somebody personally, you can have a relationship. That doesn't mean you necessarily forego all of your stereotypes, right? That the quote unquote ones are the good ones. That doesn't mean that the others are the others, whoever they may be, are pushy and greedy or whatever it is. But Nixon had a very strong relationship with Leonard Garment. He had one with Henry Kissinger. He was able to somehow maintain this kind of innate almost unthought of anti-Semitism, and yet at the same time have relationships. And yet also, Nixon did feel a certain warmth to Israel. So it's really hard to say. These are really these are complex individuals, and I think it would probably be wrong to make any simplistic statements about any of them.
Rabbi, I just want to show you something that was given to me by Richard Nixon. And I don't know if you can make it out. I'll read you the inscription. It reads, to the members of the Jewish War Veterans, Post 273, with best wishes on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of your fine organization.
Okay.
So that was my fame with Richard Nixon.
Well, I mean, I thought he might say, "Dear Marty, you're one of the good ones."
He did, but I changed the wording.
I think we have time for. Go ahead, Alan.
So growing up in a very Christian part of Wisconsin, on more than one occasion, I have a recollection of Kissenger being referred to as Nixon's Jew. And I'm wondering, do you have any perspective? Is that a commonly held, or is that just my pocket of Wisconsin?
No, I mean, there were those who did. There were those who did, and even Nixon sometimes was concerned about the optics, of having Kissinger, fears of dual loyalty charges, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not the first time I've heard that. By the way, he's not the first. People said that about Louis Brandeis. He was Woodrow Wilson's Jew back in 1916. So, that's not just Wisconsin when you're growing up. That has been the case for any number of very prominent Jews. During same thing was Hoover, who appointed Benjamin Cardozo, that you would have two Jews on the Supreme Court at the same time. And so it's been a theme for any number of presidents in the 20th century. Marty? Did you
Yeah, I read a book about the Yom Kippur War. A very fascinating time when that war broke out for those days. The war was going very, very badly for Israel. He was losing. And I don't remember the colonel's name, but he got called the prime minister and he used the quote, "The temple is going to fall. The third temple is going to fall." They really thought they were going to lose the war. I read that Nixon put there was a lot of world tension, as you mentioned before, the Soviets and the Americans. And I believe that they put on a higher level of alert, the world situation with what was going on. And then as the other person mentioned about they assembled 13 nuclear bombs because they really thought they were going to lose the war and they were going to use them
in Israel,
on Cairo, Damascus, and take them with them. So it was a very, very, fascinating, very difficult time for Israel that she was losing in the beginning. And it was a rough time, and of course many soldiers were killed. Very controversial for Moshe Dayan and Golda Meir. They were not popular after the war.
No, they paid a price politically. But Israel had honestly a little bit of a chip on its shoulder and a little bit of arrogance. And I remember, the kinds of after the 6-Day War. And the kinds of going to a Jewish day school. I remember jokes like, "You hear about the new secret Arab weapon? Yeah, it's a tank with 5 gears, 4 in reverse and 1 in forward." I mean, those kinds of jokes. And that's a very dangerous, complacency of that kind or arrogance of that kind. It's a very dangerous part of the world to cultivate that. And, Israel learned the hard way, tragically, at a quite a cost because there were 2,000 plus casualties, which is, a staggering number.
Yeah, I heard that too, because after the Six-Day War, they captured so much land, the Sinai, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and you're right, there was complacency involved. They had expanded their country so much, and they really thought that they were very secure with all the land that they captured.
Well, they had intelligence too. They had intelligence that there was, something going on, and they didn't act on it. And so, Israelis were quite. It was the Yom Kippur War that, in large measure, led to the defeat at the polls of the Labor Party, which had governed Israel since its inception, and that is how Begin came to power. So it's understandable. It is definitely understandable.
Yeah, it's a big decision to mobilize your economy, shut the economy down to prepare for war. On Yom Kippur also, it's a hard decision to make. When you turn off the economy, you have to call up all the reserves. No work gets done.
Right, but it's also when you have an existential threat, that's what you got to do. Yes, Roy, you got to. You're on mute, Roy. Roy, you're on mute. Oh, can you, Roy? Roy, we can't hear you. Can you? Nope. If I could lip read, I would.
Hi, sorry. I said I could tell you exactly when the hearings began for Kissinger to be Secretary of State. It was September 10th, 1973. The reason why George and I know that is we got married on September 9th in New Jersey, and it was a big deal. We took the Metro liner to Washington, D.C. for a short honeymoon. And when we got up on Monday morning, we said, gee, what are we going to do? And I looked in the paper and I saw that they were having the hearings for Kissinger to be Secretary of State, and it was going to be held in the Senate caucus room, the same room that the Watergate hearings were in. And we ran down and we were like first in line, and we got in to listen to the hearing. So,
okay. That maybe it was he.
I know for sure. But
yeah, no, he was. Okay, so he must have been proposed.
He was nominated, but he wasn't
in August. Yes,
but he
says here that he was in office as of September 22nd.
Yes, right.
All right, which if you think about it, that was 2 weeks.
Yeah,
before
it was a short hearing. Yeah, but I would also echo though George's comment, the question to you, in that even today, if you look at sort of the celebration that was held when the embassy was going to be moved to, the U.S. moved the embassy to Jerusalem. Several of the keynote speakers were noted anti-Semites here in the United States. And, it's some of the evangelicals are, seem to care more about Israel than some of the Jews.
Well, they have a different, agenda. But yeah, I mean, look, support for Israel and having anti-Semitic views are not mutually exclusive. So for a lot of reasons. All right, so as we come to a close to our session, any other, and maybe somebody who hasn't had a chance to share a thought or a question or. Well, our last session is next for this topic is next Monday night, which will put us about a week before the inauguration. And the last session is what I call a Jewish voter's guide to the president. The nonpartisan edition. I'm not interested. I'm not going to be talking about parties or what the next president that in 2024 should be a cross between ... This is not partisan, and I won't let the conversation become partisan. But I do think that there are themes, if we look at history of the last 2.5 centuries, that there are certain themes that are recurrent that have nothing to do party wise. Actually, what I will trace is as much as we know, when Jews voted for which party and when switches occurred. For the 19th century, there isn't much data, honestly, because statistic keeping was pretty rudimentary, and there weren't enough Jews to really merit keeping statistics. But for the 20th century, a good chunk of it there are. But I'm most interested in what should we potentially as Jewish voters look for in a president? What sorts of perspectives and approaches? And this is not a Republican thing, it's not a Democratic thing, but rather there are broader trends that I think one can look at without looking at specifics of other issues, right? There are Jews who are pro-gun, Jews that are opposed to, who want gun control, abortion. There are social conservatives, there are social progressives. This has nothing to do with, you can make an argument Jewishly on either side of the political divide on a variety of social issues and economic issues. But looking at the existential situation of Jews as a minority in this country, and as the most invested in Israel's well-being, what is it that might be those things for us to consider, whether we are Republicans or Democrats? And I think that those considerations are similar on both sides of the aisle, notwithstanding whatever our various takes on a variety of social and economic issues. So I will thread the needle, or at least try to do so, and really just summarize, I think, some broad trends based on 250 years of history. So it's the nonpartisan Jewish Voters Guide. So with that, I will bid farewell